So my name is Anneliese Taylor, and I'm the Assistant Director for Scholarly Communications and Collections at the University of California, San Francisco Library. My role with open access is in a variety of avenues of open access. We have an open access fund here at UCSF, which I manage, so I review all the applications for that. We also have an open access policy at the University of California and at UCSF. And so I provide support and training around that as well. And I also do support for the NIH public access policy, so another variety of a green open access policy. So I help people understand the nuances of the different kinds of open access, mostly between the green and the gold. And my institution is very involved in the idea of transitioning subscription publications to open access. So we have a lot of activity going on around that. So as far as how librarians and libraries can help researchers when they want to access open access materials, there's simple things such as libraries can add open access journals to their library catalogs and to their link resolvers so that they're more discoverable. Because if people aren't aware that journals are out there, it's hard for them to actually, end up using them. So we've done that at the University of California. We've actually cataloged all of the journals that are in the directory of open access journals, because we know that's a reputable source that's doing some vetting of the open access publications. So those will appear in our catalog and our link resolver. I think that's a big concern that a lot of researchers have, is that I think in theory, a lot of people like the idea of open access, but then they also hear about, so-called predatory open access journals, and then they get bombarded with these spam emails from, all sorts of publications, but I think in particular, some of the new open access journals that are oftentimes they don't have the best peer review practice, if they have any at all, or they might have some other sort of questionable practices. They spam people. And so our researchers, we hear that all the time, is that researchers are getting these emails every single day, requests from publishers to submit to their journals, to serve as editors for the journals, or to be reviewers for the articles that they are, if in the case where they do peer review. And they're a little overwhelmed with that. And I think some people just have created a response to that, which is just to completely block it out. It's like, okay, these are all spam. They just sort of put them all in one bucket. And where I think libraries can play a role is in helping them doing some assessment of, because there are, really reputable and good open access publishers that people should be aware of, and to help them be able to separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. I actually don't think that there is a single source that you can go to and say that one is all good or all bad. If you want to, we'll start off with, the blacklist approach, which is the most popular resource for that is Beall's List, which has just recently actually gone dark. Apparently that will be made available through a company called Cabell's, and it's not yet available. I think it's supposed to be hosted by Cabell's sometime this spring of 2017. What I heard when I was at the Charleston conference, so there was somebody from Cabell's in the audience, and what they said was that it would continue to be a free resource. Now, what they do, Cabell's also said that they have a white list, which is the opposite approach of, here's a list of journals and publishers that have been vetted, and we think that they are reputable or they're trustworthy. I have not, that's a subscription service, and I have not personally used that or seen that service. I know that there's some other services out there as well that are free, but it's, it's a bit of, the one that I'm familiar with is a bit of the luck of the draw. It just depends on who, it's individuals who've actually used a particular journal, and so they can go in and provide evaluations of a particular open access journal, and they can go in and provide an evaluation of what the peer review process was like, what the submission, etc., acceptance and publication process was like. But it's not going to be completely comprehensive. I personally think that it, just like a researcher would do with a subscription journal, I think that they need to use some of their own judgment in assessing a publication. And unfortunately, that means that they have to, be attentive. They have to kind of look out for details, go to that journal's website, look at things like the editorial board, look at how they describe what their peer review process is like, or just what kinds of quality and ethics kinds of compliance standards they ask for, just to kind of see if it matches what would be standard for a reputable, established journal out there in the field. And then looking at, the quality of the papers, looking at the authors of the papers that have published already in that journal, just to get a sense for, usually people are really familiar with the other institutions and other scholars in their own field. And that would be something that I would expect a scholar to, and that's certainly something that a librarian can't do on their behalf. I mean, we can kind of point them to different tools, like you can look in the DOAJ and see if the journal is listed there. You can check on a blacklist and see. I actually do think that is a valuable tool, to have a blacklist as a source, not the one and only. But if somebody has gone to the trouble to go and research a particular publisher and has outline what they thought was kind of skeptical about that particular publisher's practices, that can be very valuable information. So we can point users to tools like that, and to tell them to look for things like, look to see if it has an impact factor and a real impact factor, or similar kind of a rating from a source that and trust, such as the ISI, and now Elsevier has a similar rating system as well. Not some made-up impact factor that the publisher has come up with themselves. So I think that's where librarians can help, is to point people to the kinds of the measures or the indicators that something is a reputable publication. But as far as assessing the actual scholarship that's in that publication, like looking at the content that's there, looking at the editorial board, looking at the authors, and getting a sense from that, that's really something that's up to the scholar, because they're going to know that area the best. And you have to have some familiarity with the field as well. I don't think that open access journals are by default any harder to evaluate than a subscription journal. I think that unfortunately with the author pays model, it has created a lot of journals that really aren't doing a proper job of peer review. And sometimes the publishers have, just do things that are sort of questionable about how they, like posting a one rate for submission, and then when they actually accept an article, the rate has changed, that kind of thing. Unfortunately, I think with that author pays model, that has spawned a lot of questionable publishers. And so it has made it so that it's possible for stuff to get published that wouldn't necessarily get published in a subscription journal, because to get subscribers, you have to sort of show something for it, whereas this other model puts that momentum behind, like the possibility of somebody publishing something and being able to pay a fee for it and get it published. I do think that makes it harder, just in the sense that there is quite a bit of content that's being published in these sort of questionable journals out there. And it does put more of a burden on scholars, because because there's so many of them that have started up. And so then they have to spend time, if they're interested in perhaps publishing in that source, it takes their time and it takes effort to review that source. It's not something that you can just look in one place and then you're done. So I think from that perspective, it has added, I think it just has added to the overall volume of what a scholar would have to deal with in their field. So I think I'm always very encouraged when a researcher approaches me or approaches my library and says, I'd like to submit this to an open access journal. Can you help me identify journals that are in my field? I'm always very pleased with that, because that shows that they're open to, they're very motivated by this idea of making their content open, retaining their copyrights, and that they value having content that's truly openly accessible to anybody anywhere in the world. What libraries can do is to provide guidance on and kind of point them towards the resources that I mentioned about, looking for just the standard bearers of that it has an ISSN, that it's indexed in the Directory of Open Access Journals, for example. Also just to see where it's indexed by content discovery systems, such as, is it in PubMed, Web of Science, Scopus, whatever database would be relevant to the researcher in their field. That's definitely one issue where I think it's difficult for open access journals, for new ones, because it does often take a while before you get picked up and indexed by those databases. So I think it's like helping people look for those indicators and the other sources that would help them discern whether it's a good publication or not. And also there, a big stumbling block that often comes up with open access publishing, if it's in a journal, is more and more of just the common method of the business model for supporting open access is the author pays method. And so that's often the part where, there's some people who they really want to publish open access, but they don't have the funds to do it. And so if libraries can provide an open access fund, I think that's a really great way to really put our money where our mouth is. Libraries have been for years have been trying to encourage our scholars and our researchers to publish open access. And for people who really want to and are on board with that, but don't have the funds themselves, don't have either a research grant where they can use funds from that grant to pay for the publication costs, or a department that will help them cover those costs. Having a centralized open access fund that's either supported by the library or managed by the library is a really great way to at least support those people who fall into that camp of just not having their own funds to do that. Gold open access journals definitely have to follow just standard practices that are considered ethically sound for publishing scholarly content. I mean, there's pretty established guidelines, as far as having editorial review boards, their editorial practices, their peer review practices, and just things like, making sure that if it's scientific studies that require, or any kind of study that requires, an IRB, anything like that, any kind of like ethical standard checks, they have to be including stuff like that. I think having transparency as well about their practices, and also I think also just about their mission, like why is this journal, if it's a brand new open access journal that started up, what is their mission? What are they trying to accomplish by starting this open access journal? And so, I think sometimes it's kind of like the quality is more meaningful than the quantity. You see some of the publishers who've just started off with like 100 new journals all at once. And is there really a demand? Is there a need for that there? And so I think that's often because, with anytime there's a new scholarly journal, you have the issue of you have to attract content to that. And it's always the catch-22, because authors will be reluctant to publish in a journal that doesn't have any content, but you have to have stuff publish there in order to attract more content. And so I think if there's some kind of a niche that you can fill, either the discipline that's being served by this particular publication, or just the model, like, if I think about something like PeerJ as a model, when that came out, it was just no other open access publisher had tried what they were doing, of having a kind of like a membership model for open access, where each individual author on the paper would take up a membership with that journal. And it was lower cost than what you were seeing for your typical article processing charge for other open access journals. And so that was very novel, and that, was just offered perhaps another avenue that open access could follow than just the standard, like, pay, whatever the APC, like $1,300, $2,000, $3,000 or what have you. For green, I would say if you're talking about journals and green open access, what the ideal is to have the most flexible self-archiving rights for authors as possible. So first of all, to allow authors to self-archive their articles and their peer-reviewed version of their articles, not just preprints, and that they can make that available in a variety of places, like an institutional repository or a personal website or a departmental website or a not-for-profit site, even commercial sites. Like, I know a lot of scholars these days are using sites like ResearchGate and Mendeley, and sometimes they're uploading the publisher's final PDF there, but providing that final author's manuscript via those sites, I think, is a reasonable thing to do, because that is the author's, until they've finished that peer review process and signed a copyright transfer agreement with a publisher, that the author has all the copyrights on that work, and so they ought to be able to host that content where they see fit, where the sites that they use most frequently, and where they're already collaborating with others in their field. As far as institutional repositories, I think as much as the institutional repositories can integrate with other services, like for example, institutions that have an open access policy, a lot of them, like at the University of California, we use a system, we call it our publication system. And so we use a system that both identifies publications on behalf of users and allows them to upload their files so that they get deposited directly into our IR. So they don't have to log in separately to our IR, which is eScholarship. And, I think it's a challenge with IRs, because we're trying to keep them low cost because they're supported by institutions. But there's, I think, more and more demand for just having them be able to connect with other data sources through APIs, and just the more that we can do things to simplify the process of populating the IRs, the better, because it's something added on to what scholars already have to do. And so anything that just makes that process easier will just help the whole process move along. There is a consensus on IR. Well, I don't know if I should say if there's a consensus, but there are definitely some best practices out there for IRs. There's a really great wiki site, an open access wiki site that is run out of Harvard University. And they have collected a number of articles basically on all things open access, but there is particularly a section about IRs and best practices there. So that's a really great resource for institutions that are wanting to know more about that. Metadata, I don't know that there's so much of a consensus. I think as far as bibliographic data, it's pretty standard in order to transfer data between systems now, but I wouldn't be able to speak too much on just how much consensus there is, or how much there's standardized around that. pet peeve around open access, I think my pet peeve would have to be just the proliferation of not very high quality journals that I think have really tarnished the reputation of something that started out as really a very much grassroots scholar-led movement. So it was at the impetus of several scholars in around 2000, I think it was, that made this proclamation about that they felt that all research results should be made free and open, and they had certain ideals and for the purpose of advancing science and knowledge and patient care, that kind of thing. And then they started out with PLOS, and PLOS really broke so much ground and really was the leader, I think, that, and again, there was some of those same scientists who started PLOS and really proved that this could be done. And they've always followed like the best practices for publishing and providing really quality a really quality product, but also attracting the best research as well. And then once that model got to be kind of established and broke a lot of, or became a little bit more established, then came along a lot of publishers that wanted to sort of capitalize on that author pays model. And they've kind of muddied the waters, I think, and kind of damaged the reputation of open access. And I'd love to see less of that, or like, those that are really not doing actual peer review or that are just publishing content, especially, it's not just people publishing content that hasn't been been peer reviewed, but maybe has been done properly within their institution. But we're also seeing the scenario where people with a political agenda are also using these journals to get their content out there. So industries like the tobacco industry has picked up on that. They could put content out there that really may not be scientifically sound, but is it's in the interest of their industry. And so it's kind of like, if you think about the whole fake news phenomenon, it's like plays right into this. If you've got information that's published in a scholarly journal, it might make it look like it's sound science when it's not at all. And so I'd love to see there being just some way, and I don't really know the best way to do away with that kind of publication. That not only is it harming the open access movement, but I think it's also really bad for just our knowledge. If you have so much information out there that really has not been properly peer reviewed, and then people are reading that and thinking that it has, that's potentially very dangerous. Librarians who are very much open access advocates, and I would count myself as one of those. I think it's important for us to also keep an open mind and to really listen to what our researchers and our scholars and our students and our administrators, what they really want and what they think. I think we need to be careful about, we want to put out there why we think open access is good for our institutions and for all of the stakeholders in our institutions, and also for the greater society. But we don't want to be overbearing or do it to the point where we're just zealots and people think, oh, well, they don't really listen to, if you're putting out sort of only the positive sides and not sort of balancing that with the considerations that I think we really need to be looking at. So I think always it's just very important to be very much in tune with our community that we're closest with, so that we're so that they can see what we're saying as valid and sound.